We are going to, my plan was to finish our study on the Genesis flood, these 8 sections of this study this evening. If you remember last week, it was one of the rare sections of the study where I did not put up any pictorial slides, with the exception of these first 2 that I've used in every one of the lessons. It was a scripture study, pretty much exclusively. Well, this time, make up for that. I've got about 30 different slides this evening, and they're all, pictorial. But when you're there at the Ark and you're going through the self-guided tour, and I just really ate it all up, and I stopped at virtually every place and every station, read all the plaques, all the explanations and everything. So when you take the pictures of that, that's great. You're right there in front of it. When you try to, blow that up, on a slide for PowerPoint presentation, they're not always like you're standing right there. So I won't be able to read everything from these, but I think I'll remember most of them, the gist of what's there, and I can kind of give you just kind of a summary of what's being talked about. But in this last section, I wanted to bring out how the flood helped. It changed the landscape of the whole world, the whole globe. I've said 2 or 3 times during this study, in my mind's eye, when I would read about the flood in Genesis chapters 6 and 7 and 8, I would think about a flood. I've been through floods living on the Gulf Coast a number of times. I would watch the water rise up from the street over the curb, start heading up toward the house, and then sometimes come in the house. But that's gradually rising water. And when we're talking about the flood, it somewhere along the line, it finally got through to me. We're not talking about that kind of a flood, gradually rising water process. We're talking about a catastrophic event. We're talking about because God opened the powers of the great deep, so he broke open the earth, probably in eruptions, broke open the crust of the earth, also undoubtedly caused volcanoes to erupt all over the world, all over the globe. And so you had not just rain falling, you had rain gushing up from the crust of the earth, and there's still massive amounts of water in the crust of the earth. And so that when you're thinking about the water falling, and then the eruptions, and then the volcanics, or the earthquakes, rather, breaking open the earth and letting the water come up from the crust, and then the volcanic eruptions, you're talking about a flood that didn't just rise, but you're probably what we would call tsunamis or tidal waves, one after another, all across the globe. Now, that's a catastrophic event, and catastrophic events change the landscape. I wish I had. There's just so much information that I was studying through by way of articles, and I just couldn't bring all that in. But there's so many things that happen to just change things catastrophically. I don't know how many of you have been to Mount St. Helens. My wife and I were blessed to be able to be there a few years ago and be able to actually, for a short time, look into the crater that was blown out by that volcanic eruption. Well, that changed things. And also, as the eruption, again, cataclysmic event, it changed the landscape around Mount St. Helens. It was different. I remember watching a video of a fellow who was out, flying a helicopter looking for survivors, and he said, "I've been hunting this area, fishing this area for my whole life or whatever." He says, I don't know where we're at. I don't recognize landscape, because that was a cataclysmic event. The flood was a cataclysmic event on a worldwide scale, like nothing we have seen since. And a whole lot of things were caused by the flood and then the aftermath. And we'll talk about some of that as we go on. I'm going to move a little closer, but you'll be able to watch on the screen back there. But I want to be able to see as much as I can to be able to read on this back screen here. So again, the purpose of this study is to assure the Bible student that all of the details of the flood account in Noah's day are reasonable and believable. There are a lot of skeptics who would say, nothing like that could ever happen. I preached in a congregation for many years where we had a geologist, and I don't know that he ever believed that the flood was worldwide. And there are a whole lot of folks who don't believe that. They think it was just a localized flood. That makes no sense based upon what the scriptures say. So, and there's, a scale reproduction of the ark as it was built according to the exact dimensions laid out in Genesis chapter 6. Now, legends around the world. The Bible accurately records the historical events at Babel. Babel, the Tower of Babel, as mankind was building that tower, they got arrogant, they got prideful, self-willed, and they said, we're going to build this tower to heaven. And God said, oh, no, you're not. I'm going to stop that. Of course, they would not have reached heaven anyway. But, that was their arrogance again. But he stopped that. So he confused their language, and they then began to spread into different nationalities and dialects and populate, more of the world at that time. But there are different legends that depict basically that very event. Now, they give different details. They describe it in different phrasing, but it's remarkably in tune with what the Genesis account is sometime after the flood and the repopulation of mankind. The Papago of Arizona, the Makir of Burma, the Choctaw of the southern United States, they all have tower events in their legends that people were trying to build a tower to heaven, and then God stopped that, and the people, they couldn't understand each other anymore, and so they kind of spread out from there. So those are that's just an example of the legends that are there that correspond in essence with what the biblical account is. Now, what about flood legends? There are over 200 flood legends in different cultures around the world, going back thousands and thousands of years. Over 200 legends that talk about basically in sync with what the Bible taught. And they're talking about not just a localized flood. They're saying the world was flooded. And they'll say in a number of those legends, just a few people survived, or maybe one family survived. Again, in sync with what the biblical account is. Now, when you're thinking about, and this is something that we have a difficult time with because we don't normally see, a catastrophic event on this level. But when it says, the scriptures say, and we looked at this over the last several sections of our study, where it says that God opened the fountains of the great deep. And so volcanoes produce a lot of water, steam, the vapor goes up into the atmosphere. As I said, if we saw all of the moisture in the atmosphere all over the world rain itself out, we would only have a relatively little bit of water covering the face of the earth. But it says, and it wouldn't last for 40 days and 40 nights. But again, God can do whatever he wants to do. He's all powerful. Now, again, the atmosphere and the climate was probably a lot different before the flood than it is today. And it could have been more of a tropical or subtropical kind of environment, pretty much all around the world, more moisture. But that still would not account for 40 days and 40 nights of inundating rain. But when you start having volcanic eruptions all over the world, and especially those that are under the sea, well, then you have fissures that are opened up in the crust of the earth, and so steam rises, you have, kind of streams of steam rising up through the ocean and then going into the atmosphere. That keeps kind of refilling the atmosphere with moisture, so it would keep raining. But also just the water gushing up from the crust of the earth is going to increase that surface level of water. And the water levels would rise globally. How much water was on the earth before the flood? And what did the earth look like before the flood? There have been a lot of speculation, a lot of suggestions by geologists and such that there were not 7 continents before the flood. Or they would probably not time limit it to the flood. They would say at one time all the continents may have been all one big landmass, and it may have been that way. We see some evidence of that when you look at going up into the northern Pacific between Alaska and Russia up there, or is it Siberia? There's that little bit of a channel there that looks like it could have all been connected at one time. But when you're talking about a catastrophic event like this, that there's continual eruptions in the crust of the earth, the surface of the earth, then you would have some natural features that would take place where perhaps the tectonic plates under the earth were moving more rapidly together, and that's going to push up mountains, but also the water levels are going to rise, and with all of these massive waves of water continually sweeping across the globe, it can wash away some of the, it's going to cause a lot of erosion in a whole lot of places, everywhere basically, but it could have separated a lot of the continents into what we see today. And so it could have been just one massive, feature of land before the flood, and then the flood could have separated all of that. The water's levels would have risen, the oceans would have been higher than what we see today. Now remember, it wasn't just raining down and gushing up, but God, once the rain stopped and he closed up the fountains of the great deep, well then the waters had to recede. Those waters had to go someplace. And so undoubtedly, they raised the water levels of the oceans and the seas all over the world. And there were rivers and lakes that were everywhere. And we see the evidences of that now, except those rivers are dried. There's no river there. In one case, there still is I'm not sure if it's called the Little Grand Canyon, but there is an area where we can see that there was a waterfall that I think was twice as big as Niagara Falls. But there's no waterfall there now. We can see the riverbed, but there's no river there now. Well, that happened sometime. And so we look back, we say, well, it makes sense to us. The flood changed things. Now, there was massive burial of animal life. And this is important because of the fossil records that we have. Now, as I said, when you first had this water start to rise and everything would happen quickly, the lower class of animals, the less sophisticated, they'd be fairly quickly inundated with the water. And notice again, you're having sediment from the dry land sweeping across everywhere, and they're going to rapidly bury a lot of these animals alive. The more sophisticated animals, they're going to start going to higher ground, but eventually the water's going to catch up with them, and they're going to be inundated as well, and they're going to be buried alive, a whole lot of them. In fact, if you go down to Hot Springs, South Dakota, you can go through the Mammoth Museum there, and they have already dug up lots of fossils, bones, skeletons of mammoths and other animals that were buried in that area. And they had speculated, they had thought there were probably about 40 more, mammoths buried farther down that they had not gotten down to yet. So, and that's important to understand, that they were buried alive quickly because the fossil records show those animals there. Now, how do you date the earth? Well, people will say, the non-believers or the the skeptics will say, oh, it's hundreds of millions of old. And these animals, some of them lived 30 million years ago, like the dinosaurs, they'd say. And then there are other animals that lived farther back than that, and other animals farther back than that. So you get into the hundreds of millions of years, they say. But the fossil records, all of a sudden in the Cambrian period, it's just an explosion of animal life in the fossil records. They just all show up at once, the lower levels and the higher levels. And they don't change going on up the geologic scale through the strata of the earth. They're all there still. Well, again, if you have this incredibly worldwide cataclysmic event, you can understand why animals were buried all over the world quickly while they were still alive. And so that's what we need to understand. Water would dominate the whole earth, and that water had to go someplace. And so again, the idea that one way that God could take care of removing the waters, from the land, having them dissipate and go down, he could have raised up mountains. But the flood itself could have done that because, again, causing the tectonic plates to move more rapidly, and that would have pushed up the land masses right there in a lot of places. And so then the waters could have drained. So the ark rested ultimately on top of Mount Ararat, but there was still water everywhere all around. It rested there. Now the tops of the mountains, remember, the flood waters went up to 15 cubits, which would have been over 20 feet high, above the tops of the mountains, of the highest mountains. And so the mountain tops began to be visible, but just imagine this water continually draining down, running down. Now that's on top of the flood waters, the tsunamis and everything, but this is after it stops raining. This is after the fountains of the great deep are no longer, he's closed them up, or he's no longer bringing the water up from the earth's crust. But those waters are going to continue to run, and they're going to continue to erode the landscape everywhere. And I thought this was an interesting slide. A new world. A new world. How long did the flood last? About 1 year. Almost exactly 1 year. Before Noah and his family actually set foot back on dry land and started to move from the ark. A whole year. Almost exactly, if you read the Genesis account. Now, and so the world was changed by that time in ways that it's hard for us to imagine. In approximately 1 year, the wicked pre-flood world, consisting of a supercontinent, and that's what they speculate, that all of the land masses were together, all the continents, but now they're broken apart, and that's a possible understanding. But but now the water, the dry land rises from the waters. They're covered with layers of fossil-filled sediment, and again, all you have to do is look around us today. If there's a localized flood someplace, and seeing that down in Louisiana, it changes things. I remember going to what was called I don't know if you remember, Karen, the beach down there with Seashell Beach, or Shell Beach. It was called Shell Beach. And I remember going there shortly after I moved down there back in the early 80s. And this was a large beach, and it had seashells all over the place. Several years later, I drove back down there, and I was amazed. It was much smaller, much smaller. Well, it had eroded from the waters, the waves coming in and going out, and maybe a flood or two or whatever, hurricane or two maybe, but just in a short period of time. The earth changed catastrophically. Catastrophism changes things rapidly. So, the evolutionary view is that everything happens on the same time frame, at the same scale, basically, over eons of time. And so when you look at the geologic strata in the earth, all of these layers, they say, okay, this layer takes this many years for it to develop, or to be laid down, and then there's some erosion between layers, and then the next layer is built up, so that's where you get the hundreds of millions or billions of years. Well, that's the evolutionary view. But catastrophism changes the whole picture rapidly, quickly, catastrophically. And so the biblical view is, and when you look at the strata in places like the Grand Canyon, you see, no, the evidence appears that these layers were laid down rapidly on top of one another. And not over, even thousands of years, but rapidly within just a very short period of time. And literally, that's the flood of 1 year. It was that massive, that catastrophic. The effects of it were that incredible. Now, just some comparisons. You'll have some scientists who will look at pictures that we now can receive from Mars, sending, satellites up and everything, and with our, newest telescopes that can see farther into the universe than we've been able to see, more clear pictures. And they point out that it looks like, and these are just 4 different features, that it looks like that at one time Mars had a lot of water on it. Looks like dried up riverbeds and pebbles that would look like pebbles from seas and so on, how they'd be rounded out and everything because of the erosion and everything, and all of that, and even perhaps some ice, like glacier moving and all that. And so there's some speculation. They say it looks like Mars was flooded, a global flood at one time. Well, there's no water on Mars. None at all. But when you compare it to what the Genesis account says, they'll say, no global flood ever happened here. And yet, the earth is covered, 70% of the earth is covered with water. No water on Mars. But they say, look at the evidence. It looks like maybe there's a global flood on Mars. The whole planet was covered with water at one time because of the features that are there. We see the features here on the earth. We say, no, never happened here. Never happened. And yet, no water is found on Mars. The earth is 70% of it's covered with water. It's interesting what Peter wrote in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 6. The world that then existed before the flood perished, being flooded with water. Being flooded with water. When you close your mind to the truth, then you're open to all kinds of non-truths. If you're prejudiced against what really is right in front of your face, which the evolutionists are, then you're not going to believe what is obvious. Well, uniformitarianism, and that is the principle, the theory that says everything just happens at the same pace all the time, and it just keeps on going. If it takes 10,000 years for a particular level of the Earth's strata to form, then the next phase is going to take however many thousands of years or whatever, and so on and so on. But again, what we observe does not fit that, because we see rapid laying down of different levels of the strata. And if you think about what a global flood on that scale and that kind of catastrophe, would bring, it would lay down sediment all the time over that period of that year, but also over the period that would follow, where those waters would recede from the mountains and all down, and now new riverbeds would be formed, and new lakes and everything, and then they would eventually drain into bigger rivers that would flow into the seas. But the evidence would be back there, and so they would lay down the sediment rapidly. As I said, when I was living in the Gulf Coast, I was told by a fellow who worked in the oil fields offshore that the Army Corps of Engineers have to continually dredge the mouth of the Mississippi River because of all the sediment that massive river keeps running down and depositing at the mouth of the river as it meets the Gulf of Mexico. So the ships can still navigate through that mouth and on up the river and bring all of the cargoes that they bring inland. Well, that's just one place, and that's just one river. So if we're talking about all over the world, it's difficult to really wrap our minds around, again, all that could happen there. So is denying the biblical flood, the Genesis flood, is that science, real science, or is it just bias? From a whole lot of what I've read and observed and studied, when we're talking about when you're talking about scientists and biologists that say, no, this is all evolution, and we came from, one-celled animal, and it was all gradual over millions and eons of time and all of that. But when you compare it to the evidence of what we know about life, but they refuse to accept their error, their erroneous thinking. They refuse to accept that a higher power. Now, some of them have retreated and said, well, yeah, maybe an alien race on another planet. Now, is that absurd or not? Why don't you just come down to what we have this tremendous record for us. God created the heavens and the earth and all life thereon. God is the master designer. He is the higher power. So, but people are biased against it. The Grand Canyon, again, there are just features in the strata of the Grand Canyon that deny or that refute the idea of gradual layers over. Also, the Colorado River runs through the base of the Grand Canyon, and so the geologists tell us that over eons of time, that has eroded away the Grand Canyon. Down, however many of you have been there, I know a number of you have, that is a massive canyon. Did you ever look at the size of the Colorado River at its base? It's not big enough to do all that damage, even over that period of time. It's much smaller than the massive stretch from the top of the canyon and then going on down. Other features such as rocks that are bent, if it had happened over a long period of time, they would have been broken. We have dug down, we have excavated, they're not broken, indicating they were laid down that way quickly and then covered up. And again, different features of the strata indicate that it was laid down quickly over a short period of time. Sediment layers deposited across the continent. When you look at some of the sandstone in different parts of the world, it's the same in all of those places, and it's basically at the same place in the geologic strata, indicating it was all laid down at the same time. Now, these are if you want to really look at it, the scientific, evidences of what we're talking about. We're often told that it takes long periods of time to form a fossil. Well, I talked about how the animals were buried alive quickly. We've even found some mammoths in Alaska, I believe, that they were so well preserved that some of the Eskimos would actually cut off the meat and feed them to their dogs, or the wolves would get there when they finally, were the ice melted around them and they were exposed. The meat was still edible. That's incredible. That's how quickly they were buried. But after an animal dies, it is slowly buried by sediment, and over thousands or even millions of years, as some of the geologists would tell us, the fossil is formed as minerals in the ground replace the bones and other organic materials of the creature. But unless they are buried rapidly and preserved, then the animals decompose after dying. And thus, fossils are found to only form relatively quickly under the proper conditions. the flood would have provided those conditions. Rapid burial, death, then rapid burial, and the sediments would have quickly moved over them on an increasing basis. I think because our time is getting a little bit short here, I think I'm just going to stop here, park, and in a couple of weeks we'll come back and finish this particular section of the study and maybe open it up to some questions or thoughts or observations that you might have, because I don't want to take us too long. But I hope you're enjoying. I hope it's helping your faith be even stronger, because we're seeing the evidences. And maybe I can even bring in some more material, but I probably will hesitate to do much of that. So you can cut off the PowerPoint at this point. Appreciate that, Damon.